Okay, Dad, happy Friday. Today
Okay.
is June 14th. Because it's Friday, do we have any good news to talk about?
Uh, um, Not really. I
Okay,
mean,
all right.
we
All
could
right. Well, just
pretend, we could say, oh, we have a ceasefire that's been, offered by, well, supposedly by the Israelis. But we talked about that and how that's not really what it appears to be. And then today there was a peace proposal from from Vladimir Putin. But I I don't think it was actually very surprising, and it's not really a peace proposal. It's just kind of like the minimum requirements for the basis for peace negotiations.
hmm.
And there's no sign that the other side is going to negotiate at this point.
Yeah, with talking about that ceasefire deal, it seems I saw some other headlines in the past couple days that also just talking about sort of the confusion around it. So it seems like it
Yeah,
is kind of a bogus deal. We were pretty, our
I think we're
assessment was
right. I
accurate.
think yeah, I think that's exactly it's something that the Americans put forward, pretended that the Israelis did. It's clear that the Israelis did not and never will accept it. It runs counter to everything they've been saying all along. And then Yahoo was, said directly, yeah, this is nothing that we can support.
Hmm.
Um,
Do
and
you
yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, do you think it's possible for Israel to even survive in a multipolar world? It seems like they could only exist with the U.S. backing, that this is that
Uh,
giant. But in the world that we're entering into now, it'll be a world where the U.S. can't push everybody around and dictate the shots. We are moving to a multipolar world. It
yeah,
seems clear. It seems inevitable. It might take 5 to 10 years for kind of the new everything to shake out and fall into place and people understand the rules of the new world. But in that new world, which we're, I think, inevitably heading to, can Israel survive in that world?
well, I suppose they could, but it just becomes much more difficult. I mean, I think right now we're witnessing the transition, from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. It's happening before our eyes. And actually, this war in Gaza is part of it. It's in fact accelerating the process. The U.S. is desperately trying to keep things as they were, to maintain the status quo, in which they were again, the unrivaled power pretty much worldwide, but especially in the Middle East. For the longest time, all these various, uh, peace negotiations, peace formulas, whatever, where they were all sponsored under the aegis of the United States, because the U.S. was just the dominant power, and everybody recognized it, whether they liked it or not. But that's changing now. We can see it's already happened with, I think recently the Arabs, or there's a conference planned, as I understand, right, of Arab nations, um, but with the sponsorship this time of China, or at least this is something that's in the offing. And that would never have happened before. Now, it doesn't change anything immediately in the short term, but it's indicative of a long-term shift in power and and how this conflict, if it ever is resolved, it may not be resolved. It may be resolved. Maybe with the assistance or sponsorship of China rather than the U.S. Again, I think we're
Mm.
looking years in the future.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I feel like in this new world, Israel wouldn't will have to change its policies or become a complete pariah,
Yeah,
which it's already becoming a pariah other than the United
right.
States only. So
Yeah, well, again, I mean, obviously Israel has relied on the U.S. To to conduct the policies, to carry out the slow motion ethnic cleansing that it has been carrying out over the past several decades. The U.S. has protected it from various pressures, UN resolutions, and so forth, to get it to withdraw from the occupied territories. It's never
mm,
had to do that because it had the U.S. at its back, and the U.S. was the unchallenged. It seemed like a very safe position, and it's still the U.S. is very powerful, and and is enabling, of course, Israel to do what it's doing. But its power is waning. I think everybody can see it. And I imagine, the Israeli leaders realize this too, but they don't see any alternatives.
Hmm.
So they're going to stick together. And then the U.S. on its side um, knows that, this relationship is becoming increasingly toxic, right? And that it's had to pay a very high price, because of its unconditional support for Israel. Um, and well, that was so you get forces on both sides. I mean, there's this U.S. power is diminishing, and then the U.S. itself is sees that it's has to be aware of its growing weakness, and has to be aware too that Israel is contributing to this trend. That's so these are all. Again, in the short run, it may not make a bit of difference, but the long run, the trends are looking very bad for Israel.
Hmm. Yeah, it's kind of ironic because it seems like we become aware that we are kind of losing control. And the more we do to try to preserve the unipolar system, our global hegemony, the faster we are eroding it.
Right.
We're doing that in Russia. We're doing that. You're talking about with Gaza and Israel, Palestine, Israel, and the same thing with Taiwan and China. All of our positions here are trying to preserve that hegemony. And the more we try to preserve it, the weaker we become and the more exposed we become because we don't want to cooperate and move forward into this multipolar world. And it's becoming so apparent, and the rest of the
Right.
world can see, like, hey, why can't you guys just, all get along and quit trying to boss everybody around? Um,
Mhm.
well,
Yeah.
speaking about, yeah, just to, talking about Gaza is speeding up that process, hastening the move to the multipolar world. Um, Obviously, the Ukraine war, I think, is maybe even more significant in terms of moving to the multipolar world, because that's kind of a direct confrontation of sort of military might challenge, that's
Right.
been all of
And
a sudden,
economic might.
and
Don't
economic
forget,
might.
it's also an
Actually,
economic war, and that's something that clearly the Russians are winning.
right.
I mean,
Actually, I just wanted
even more
to.
dramatically than they are on the military front. They are winning on both fronts, but I think the economic victory has been real stark. And again, there's more that we learn about the state of the Russian economy, the clearer it becomes that these sanctions were just an absolute failure, a total
Right.
flop.
Yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit more about that actually, because we just had a new round of fresh economic sanctions. I think like 300 economic sanctions. And it seems like this package that they just released 2 days ago of economic sanctions is the biggest one since basically the beginning, from my understanding. Um, and so far, we've seen Russia shrug everything off. I assume they'll shrug this off. Actually, we've seen them do more than shrug it off. It seems to have actually bolstered their economy, and their economy is growing. Investment is up. Their first quarter GDP growth was at like 5.4%. They're actually concerned that they're growing too fast. They are now by purchasing power parity, which is really the only measurement you should be using. Nominal
Right.
GDP doesn't matter that much. They are now the fourth largest economy. So they've surpassed Japan and Germany in terms of growth.
Right.
So it's, talk about a backfiring, policy with these economic
Right.
sanctions. But we have just, rolled out another barrage of economic sanctions. Can you maybe talk about the consequences of this?
Well,
Um,
yeah, I think again, it may create difficulties for them in the short term, but in the long run, I think it accelerates the current process. It gives them even more incentives, gives the Russians and their trading partners like the Chinese and the Turks and the Indians, an even greater incentive to develop alternative systems. I mean, this has been the problem all along. It's like if you at one time, there was this one open, um, fair system, open to all comers that that the U.S. supported, you know, and a major component of that system, of course, is the U.S. dollar itself. Um, so this is something that everybody can use. It's convenient, and it has a history of well, a history again of being sound and based on law and based on a true rules-based order, not the so-called one that that they're pushing now. But in fact, there was a rules-based order, that everybody wanted to be a part of. But the the tragic or foolish mistake that the Americans made was just uh, to use a system whose greatest strength again was its fairness, its lack of political preference, or um,
Yeah, it's
did not
impartial.
make distinctions between friends and enemies, between different nations. This was the currency, this was the financial system, where anybody could come and trade and invest and so on and so forth. But they took this, that had the system that had those advantages, had that, that reputation that had been developed over decades, and turned it against the Russians, right? They weaponized it. They had done it earlier. It's not the first time, but obviously Iran. But Iran is a much smaller player, and I think that was a warning signal. But a lot of people didn't pay attention. There was all around, whatever. This was just an exceptional circumstance, and maybe they really are crazy and whatever. But the Russians were big, and we were pretending that they were smaller than they were. But again, these, like these IMF reports that have come out demonstrated how big they were, right? It was the fourth largest economy, and you were going to cut them out. And by doing that, what were you thinking? That they would just kind of shrivel up and die? Well, you did two things. One is you shot yourself in the foot because you harm the reputation of your own economic system, right? Your own financial system, and of the dollar itself. But then the other thing you did was to give Russia and all its trading partners a very powerful incentive, to build up an alternative system, a competitor to your own system. And and again, these things, they can create problems for the Russians, but they've demonstrated the ability, to overcome these obstacles. And I'm sure that this is true, in this case too. Maybe in the short run, it'll create some problems. There'll be some obstacles. Trade might slow down, but they and their trading, this trade, there's just too much of an incentive on, for the various parties that are involved to make it work, and they will make it work.
Hmm.
Again, you're just foolish to think that they're just going to all kind of curl up or just give up and return to your system. No, you've actually created a sense of incentives that just are going to inevitably result in a very powerful alternative system. So we have, one example, of course, the BRICS is talking about setting up their own transaction system, an alternative to SWIFT. And already the Russians have made arrangements, bilateral kind of arrangements with different trading partners, and they've been very successful. And I'm sure they'll continue to do that.
Yeah, big changes and innovations usually don't arise until there's a real necessity.
Right.
And that's essentially what we did is we created that. And I mean, obviously Russia knew it was coming, so they prepared a little bit in advance. And then once it happened, they're like, okay, now we have to make, we prepared for this, but now we have to adapt quickly. And they've shown that they can. So yeah, this is just another perfect example of the U.S. trying to preserve its hegemony, and in doing so, they are
Right. They're
ushering
undermining
into
their own hegemony by
right.
doing
They're
this.
undermining their own hegemony.
Right.
Do you have any idea? I imagine it takes a while for people's habits and systems and the infrastructure, financial infrastructure, all that to change and be built. Do you know how long it would take for the BRICS to really create a system that kind of is that is alternative system that is really starts to be adopted, and we see real large global trade being done through this system? Do you know how long that would take? I mean, we're already seeing it to some
Yeah.
extent, right? Like between Russia's trade, it's the fourth largest economy now. 80% of its trade is now done outside of the U.S. dollar system, and I think probably with this newest round of sanctions, I think they're saying they're going to move to zero, right? That it's just like no more
Right.
dollars at all, which hurts us. Like
Right.
Thomas Massey did a good job explaining it, saying basically anybody that's using our currency, we are able to print off more and let it be absorbed, which
Right.
basically is like getting a
Right.
transaction fee for every single person
Yeah.
using the dollar. We take an
Well,
extra three
that's another
percent.
aspect. I mean, it's also just the bad policy back home, inflationary policy. devalues. You could get away with it again, when there was no alternative. It just was for the longest time. Okay, the dollar was the only game in town, and it would just take so much of an effort to build up an alternative system that people had, other governments had complaints. Hey, you're inflating your currency here, so when we park our money here, it starts to lose value, right?
Mm,
But there really wasn't an alternative. But now you're making sure that there will be alternatives. So then that actually contributes to the domestic decline, or it makes the inflationary policy, the various domestic policy mistakes, um, much more serious. The consequences of that, I think are are much greater and more real than they used to be. We were insulated by that fact that we were the reserve currency, and just the notion that we could not, maybe one day would not be. It was out there, as a possibility, but it was always in the distant future. And no longer is it in the distant future. It's, in the kind of a foreseeable future. And so when people, again, these different governments are thinking, hey, not only is there a risk in, um, parking my money, there in dollars, because there's this chance that they'll freeze it or whatever, will become an enemy of the Americans, for whatever reason. But then there's also this much kind of more prosaic question, but a very important one is like, hey, what kind of return am I getting on this? I'm losing money by
mm,
doing this. Before
right.
they just
And
accepted it. People lost, these governments lost money, but that was the only place. Now if you have an alternative, you accelerate the process. Various governments will start moving their money out of the dollar into different currencies.
right. And I guess they have to assume that they're going to be losing value on their dollars at an increasing rate if they kind of just look at the just sort of the accounts of the U.S. Treasury. That we have $35 trillion in debt. We have a
Right.
high interest rate right now. We're adding $1 trillion every 100 days. So how are we going to finance that
Right.
debt? I think some people are looking a little bit down over the horizon and realizing like the only way that the U.S. can finance this debt is to inflate it away, to print it.
Yeah.
So we gotta park our money somewhere else.
Right.
And this
I
can,
think
but
this
will
is
this
actually, yeah, just one other thing, because I think we brought this up before. It's just like most people aren't concerned with these geopolitical questions. They just seem to be completely oblivious to them. They're huge, like we're talking about. But this is one area where they're going to feel it. It's
Mm,
just the fact again, because the dollar system was based on America's power and prestige,
mm,
right? And when that prestige and that power is reduced, then the dollar becomes vulnerable. And you might not care about Israel or Ukraine or any of a number of conflicts around the world, but you will care. I mean, I'm talking about the U.S. citizen. When the a run on the dollar begins, and that's going to happen in large part because of these geopolitical mistakes that the U.S. government has made.
Can you explore that a little bit more for us? A run on the dollar? What do you mean? How does that work exactly? Is it when all of a sudden people just start dropping dollars and then panic and then we have hyperinflation? Can you break it down a little
Right.
bit more?
I can't say that that I know for a fact that that's how it's going to end, but that's something that happens in financial systems. These things can move slowly and then they can move very fast, and that is, as some asset that seemed to be very secure can stay there and seem as solid as a mountain, and then begins to erode. There's some people begin to have doubts about it, or they see alternatives that are superior. They begin to move their money out of it, and the price begins to drop. Its value, is decreases. And this can be gradual. It can go on for years, but at some point there's a tipping point, which often happens, in uh, with regard to especially financial assets. And the dollar is a kind of financial asset. This um, there's some point when um, more than a small minority of people become aware of the problem, and then they're thinking, my God, this thing is going to keep on dropping, and it could start going fast. So, you know, so more and more people begin to pull it out as they pull, um, their assets out of the dollar. They try to go to another currency. then the value of the dollar decreases that much more rapidly, and that's how you get a collapse. You talk about a run on the bank. That happens. There may be a bank that has a very solid reputation, right? It's been there for decades. Everybody's got a big granite blocks, and it seems as solid as can be. And then there are some rumors, and some people, especially in the know, start to move their money out quietly. And at some point, it gets out into the public, and then you have people running to the teller's windows, demanding, "Give me my cash, let me." And then they don't have it. The whole thing. It's because
Mm.
these financial systems are based on trust and reputation. We think of them as being sort of like as solid as granite, right? It's just something that it's always been there, always will be there. But in fact, there's no guarantee of that. I mean, it's
I'm surprised that it hasn't happened yet, to be honest. I always look at the exchange rates and, because obviously my business in China, and I'm always surprised about the strength of the dollar. I know that China is shedding treasuries, is
right.
decoupling, but it doesn't seem to have an effect on the system. Is the system is just so huge and so
I
big
think
that
that's right. I mean, it's right. I mean, it is. America is still a very powerful country, and it still has a very large economy, and it's dominant in many ways. And that has it's still there. I mean, it is a giant, but it is in decline. That's what we're talking about. And an empire in decline, at some point, it ceases to be the dominant power. And I think we're approached that day is not so far off.
Hmm.
Um, but up until then, yeah, things can be just as they always were. I've noticed that, like even what was in the 2008 financial crisis. Well, this was a crisis that really was um, that erupted in the U.S. economy. We kind of because of bad policies, and there was a financial meltdown in the U.S. economy. But what happened, and then there were consequences around the world. But everybody rushed to the dollar, even though it was really this is where the problems originated from. But still, that was it. That's just sort of the instinct that everybody had, is that like in difficult times, go to the dollar, and that's those old habits. Um, um, don't die easily. They're well ingrained, and they're 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 probably good guides, up until a point. But nothing lasts forever. That's the thing. It's just like every empire. It has kind of seems like it's going to last forever, but it always falls at some point. And when it falls, it can fall quickly. Especially financial systems, the financial dimension to it.
Yeah. Do you have any idea of what might start to trigger it and cause it? I feel like that's how it's going to happen. You said that sometimes financial systems they're in steady decline and sometimes they go fast. Is there any examples of where it just a system just slowly just petered out and it just a long slow death? Because the ones that I learned in economics are always the more interesting ones, the hyperinflation in Argentina or the Weimar Republic, or
Uh,
Zimbabwe. Um, like do you see is there anything comparable in history? Because one thing about these other currencies, these examples I talked about, they were never the world reserve currency. Is there any type of situation that we can compare to?
right. Well, I'm just thinking about um, empires that maybe kind of aged more or less gracefully, like the Dutch. At one time, the Dutch had a great, were the greatest seagoing power,
Hmm.
and they were eclipsed by the Brits. But they didn't just fall off a cliff. Dutch to this day, not Dutch, but the Netherlands to this day,
Hmm.
right, is a very prosperous country. They aged gracefully. They retreated. Maybe you could say the same thing to a certain extent about the British pound. I mean, it was a difficult adjustment, but they were, at one time the British pound was really the world's reserve currency, according to my understanding,
Yeah.
and
Well,
it
the
was
thing that's
eclipsed by the dollar.
I would just say the thing that the main difference between that is during the Dutch, that they were using the guilder, which was backed by gold. The pound was sterling silver, so
Right.
these weren't fiat currencies. What's different in our system is that it's not backed by any tangible, real substance. So I mean, like
Right.
there is no intrinsic value in the dollar. It's just the faith of the system and the
Right.
confidence game, and the
Right.
confidence is breaking down. So
Right.
in that sense, I think there is no historical comparison. So I don't see a way for it to gracefully go out unless we
Right.
find a way to repeg the dollar to gold or repeg the dollar to
Right.
something like Bitcoin or something that has scarcity that and can maintain its value. But
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Again, yeah, it's based on trust. It's based on reputation. And so again, it's when the reputation of the U.S. suffers and of its, of the dollar suffers, that puts it at risk. In the end, there's really nothing else. So it still may be quite strong, but any diminution in the prestige and the let's say the psychological soundness, that underlies the dollar, is potentially catastrophic, or it could down the road it could have catastrophic consequences. Because you're
mhm.
right, there's really nothing else.
Right. Yeah, it's scary. The bottom could just drop out. So that's what I think will happen. I really do. I really think that there'll come a day where all of a sudden, like you said, people will wake up and be like, "Whoa, whoa, we can't leave our money in the dollars. This system's broken. It's not working. There's an alternative available." And all of a
Right,
sudden,
and that's the
it's who
big
can
thing. So
drop it,
right,
who can get
right,
rid of it as fast as you can because it's going
right,
to zero quick. You know.
right,
Um, yeah. What's crazy to me is that if you and I can just figure this out easily enough, why surely Janet Yellen understands. I mean, she was Jeffrey Sachs's teacher, at
uh-huh,
Harvard. The people in that work at the Treasury, that work, in the State Department or whatever, they're supposed to be smart people. And I'm sure they are. Do you think
right.
they actually understand what's happening, and they just, even though they understand, they're just sort of forced to kind of go along with this, even though they know that this is bad in the long term, but there's so much pressure, because the political system is just
Yeah,
geared on the next 4 years short term. So they
right. Well, it's
just look
hard.
at that.
Yeah, it is hard to understand. There has been resistance from the central bankers and from leaders in the financial sectors in both in Europe and in the U.S. to a lot of the moves that the politicians have made recently. We've talked earlier about the seizure of Russian assets, for example, and there has been constant, actually, uh, quite considerable resistance to that from financial experts. And so there are still people, with this understanding that kind of that are have a good handle on reality, on these, let's say, financial realities, and they do push back. I've heard, from different sources that, for example, when at the outbreak of the Ukraine war, and when the U.S. launched its economic war against Russia, there was real resistance to at least certain aspects of that, from the Federal Reserve. That's a rumor anyway, and I wouldn't be surprised. But it just seems, I don't know what it is, whether they understand this is a big mistake, but politically they just have to submit. Maybe that's it, because in the end, for the Federal Reserve or these central banks, to continue and for the directors or governors of these various banks to maintain their positions, they do have to accommodate the politicians. And
Mm-hmm.
and so, I don't know how much of it is conscious. Like, they say, "Oh, I know this is stupid, but I just got to do it," or it just there are these ideological pressures that just warp thinking, and it may be, it's like in the case of Janet Yellen, I don't know if she's really believes all this stuff, or if she's just been, she's so much a part of the establishment that U.S. hegemony is just second nature, and in the end it kind of blinds her to a lot of um, you know obvious risks. It's just like the obsession with destroying Russia and maintaining American hegemony is so strong among the elite that they don't really even see things clearly. That's why they're making bad decisions. And again, I don't know how much of it's conscious, to the extent where, okay, just they're obeying orders basically, or responding to political pressures and maybe doing so, with an awareness that it's wrong, or if their own thinking really has been corrupted. And that's a question I can't really, I can't see into their minds. I don't know what's going on. I think it's one or the other.
One of the things I think is the problem with our system, and maybe just a fatal flaw of the U.S. government system our founding fathers set up, was having these term limits for the president. I think it causes a real big. It sounds great because you're like, good, we can't have this. Will make sure we never have a dictator that has iron power. But the problem is that it just lends to short-sightedness. It lends to overspending because everybody's gearing up for an election every 4 years, and then you get a new president that every president wants to make his stamp, his mark on the world, enact new policies, spend more things, destroy whatever, and do whatever it can to make people happy in the short term, like a huge stimulus spending during COVID or whatever,
Right.
because they know that it's not, they almost feel like, okay, well, it'll be the Republicans' problem next election cycle. So let's do it and we can do good and we'll look good and they'll all carry the bag. And that's kind of the way the system works. So
Right.
if you look at economies that really, have done well, I'm thinking, for example, like Singapore, you had one guy that was like, okay, I'm going to rock this
Lee
for
Kuan Yew.
60 years. Yeah, sorry, what was his name again?
Lee Kuan Yew.
Yeah, Lee Kuan Yew.
Right.
So for like 60 years, and you're able to map up long-term plans. Like, okay, we're building, just like building anything to last, it takes time. So guys, don't, strap in. It's going to be gradual growth. We're going to build a solid foundation. And look at Singapore now, one of the
Right.
wealthiest places in the world per capita. Incredible. And then same thing you can say with, Putin. Even, he inherited a mess in the 90s, and he's been in power for over 20 years now, and has been able to put long-term plans. And the same can be said even for the Chinese. When they do
Certainly.
these plans, they do 5 year. They have 5 year, 10, 20 year plans, 50-year plans for their country, so that they can do slow, investment over time and build a solid foundation.
Right.
But the way it
Yeah.
is in the U.S., nobody's got it. Nobody even has a 2 year plan. I feel like
Right.
the plan is like, what can we do to put out this fire right now? That's
Yeah.
all we
Well,
care about. And
right.
then we'll do the next one, and we'll just do it each one as they come along.
And
And then you slowly just destroy yourself, overspend because you didn't plan for the future. Because our political system, with its term limits, is actually, I think, a big problem. I feel like a better system would be like if you had someone like Eisenhower and he was a great president. Why not let him keep on going? Everybody likes
hmm
him. He's piloting the ship well. Think about
uh-huh.
it if you're running a company. It's like, oh, I love, Apple or whatever. And then, but every 4 years, we have to put in a new guy. It's like, doesn't give a lot of confidence investing in that company in the long term, because
hmm
you can get a new guy that's going to shake everything up. It's like, no, this guy's rocking it. Let's keep him in there as long as he can, because he knows how the system works and he has a long-term plan and he's got his things in place and he's doing a good job running the company. And we can have an election every 4 years. Not saying there's no elections, but let the guy, if he's doing a good job, let him keep running the country or the company or whatever it is, right? Doesn't that make sense? Why do we have this? Well, I don't know. We can't do. If one thing's fall apart, I'm going for, forget these the term limits. You can only serve one time or two times. If you're doing a great job, keep going. If
uh,
just compete, vote. I don't know. Do you think that's a big problem with our system? Like that,
yeah,
this.
well, certainly short-termism, that's it, and term limits definitely contribute to that. Yeah, because a lot of economic policies can be painful in the short run.
Mm,
Wise policies can, if you're really going to, if let's say resources are being misallocated, and that's what inevitably happens. And I think, before big busts, that's an explanation for the boom bust cycle, is that, okay, we have large amounts of resources are being, misallocated. And then when they get way out of whack, you have this painful correction, and then you start all over again.
Mm.
Um, now,
But we don't allow for the painful
yeah,
correction
well,
anymore.
that's
That's the
exactly
problem.
right. Is that anybody who actually like proposes a policy, let's say it's going to just pop the balloon, say pull out the needle and say we got to pop this balloon and and get back to something solid again. Well, that person immediately is voted out of office. If he's a politician. So everybody has an incentive. It's just sort of kind of to play along, just like right now. Of course, the budgets are just the budget deficits are huge. The debt is growing at just in a very alarming rate, and it's just astronomical at this point. Um, and if you're going to propose real serious fiscal discipline, that seems like the obvious solution, right? Is that to save the country from disaster, but it's going to be in the short run, it's going to be very painful, and it's just like I use another analogy, like cutting out a tumor, but maybe, that'll set you back. But eventually, you recover from the surgery, the tumor's gone, and you're okay, right? And
Mm.
you can live a long, healthy life. But it is, again, if you're the guy with the scalpel or you're the guy with the uh, the pin that pricks the balloon, then you're the scapegoat. That's how it works now. So nobody wants to be that scapegoat. So everybody, even if they're aware of the problem, they just decide to ignore it. And so, our deficits continue to balloon. And then one day it'll just happen. And then we'll see. Well, maybe
Mm.
there will be some rational leaders to pick up the pieces that's needed to happen and we can start all over again. But just based on what I've seen, I just don't find there are so few rational people out there that really have an understanding that probably they're going to blame it on the Russians when it happens or on the Chinese or the
Oh, well,
Salvadorans or
100%.
something, who knows?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It just seems like the way our system works, we're just doomed at this point. There's no way out of it. The spending we can't stop spending. We can only raise taxes so much. So, uh, yeah, we're just going to have to collapse. And, I think we're in that process now. We'll see how long it takes. Um, Okay, well, maybe we can pivot a little bit more, and I wanted to talk to you about the neo-Nazi situation in Ukraine because there was some news that broke 3 or 4 days ago about uh, Biden is now supplying weapons to the neo-Nazi brigades, the Azov Battalion. Previously, Congress banned it because they recognized that this brigade was openly engaged in Nazism and Nazi symbolism and ideology. So they said no funding to this group. But now that's been lifted, and so we're sending money there. And we've always kind of heard these claims that there's a lot of neo Nazis in Ukraine, but I think a lot of people don't really understand that situation. What because I think when a lot of people hear like, oh, there's Nazis in their mind in America, they might think like, oh, they're probably just like people in Alabama. That's what they're thinking.
Yeah. Well, one
Like
thing,
they
I mean,
have
it's a term that's so much abused in this country that it's hard to take seriously.
right
There's a
because
lot of
people
screaming
think
about
people
Nazis or whatever. And
right.
people now, like so many people on the left call anybody on the right a Nazi or whatever. It sort of ceases to lose meaning. And
Mm,
then, when they're actually, there's been a real inflation of terms. I remember, it used to be that racist, that was really a devastating term. And now that's just so common that nobody even notices it when somebody's called a racist or anything, it hardly even responds. It used to be, that would, cause the recipient of the insult to quickly make denials and say, oh, not me, not me. I don't have a racist bone in my body. But now it just gets thrown around so much. It just, who cares? And then we went from that to white supremacist and Nazi. And so virtually every Trump supporter is basically a Nazi and Trump himself is a fascist. And
right. I
so,
think that yeah,
right.
exactly.
So, yeah. So, you talk about Nazis and then, when they actual like neo-Nazis in the US are their numbers are so small that the actual neo-Nazi groups or something that maybe there's one here that numbers 20, another there that numbers 30, and half of them are, you know, feds or informants. I mean,
Right.
seriously, I don't think that's much of an exaggeration. So it's a really kind of a completely insignificant reality. It doesn't really exist in the U.S. It's
Mm.
something that's thrown around. Now, Ukraine's different because they're first of all, right during World War II, there was a significant Ukrainian force that was allied, and I think was actually put under the command of German Nazi forces that worked closely with them, and that was led by Stefan Bandera. And um, now, yeah, there really wasn't much difference. Of course, he was concerned about Ukraine, and he wanted to create a kind of a pure Ukraine, a Ukraine for the Ukrainians. That means a Ukraine that's free of Poles. That was actually, one of his. That's one of the great ironies now. It's like again, Ukraine is receiving so much support from Poland, but the Banderites were like maybe their number one enemy was the Poles, because there were a lot of Poles that were living in the land that they considered to be Ukraine, but also Jews, also Russians, and also just other Ukrainians that were political enemies. And they killed a lot of them, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. Um, and eventually, of course, they were defeated by the Soviet army. That's what happened. But the but one thing that really sets them apart, like the German Nazis, is that their their involvement, their fight actually continued after World War II. And how did that happen? Well, it was a lot of the leadership of this, of the Banderite movement sought refuge in the West. A lot of them ended up in Canada, in particular, and also in the U.S. And the U.S. saw an opportunity there that when the Cold War began, they had these people who were rabidly anti-Russian or anti-Soviet, and they said, well, heck, maybe we can support um, an anti-Soviet movement, an insurgency in Ukraine. And they attempted to do that. It went on for years, and they actually infiltrated these Ukrainians, these followers of Bandera, real, basically real Nazis are very closely allied with the Nazis, and and went on. They had very little success. I think the Soviets again and again, found these people, um, foiled their plots, but it went on to I think approximately 1956. So it went
Mm.
on a lot longer than World War II itself. And then when the Soviet Union fell and then Ukraine got its independence, um, there were a lot of people with a fairly fresh historical memory of the Banderites, and they carried on the memory. They reestablished these organizations, and they adopted symbols that were SS symbols and Nazi symbols, occasionally the swastika, um, um, and all through Ukraine, especially in Western Ukraine, you find statues of Stefan Bandera. Now, he's considered by the West as being, essentially a kind of a little Hitler, or one of somebody who was on the same moral plane, the way that the West looks at it. But they decided to look the other way. In the past, before the war broke out, you could find that there was, even then there was a tendency to kind of look the other way, to downplay it. But articles would come out in the New York Times and in other major newspapers and media outlets. Oh, Ukraine does have a Nazi problem, and you say back then, even the kind of the counter argument was, well, like when the elections happen, they only get like 2% of the vote. The various far right groups in Ukraine, that's the right sector, um, I think there's C-14. Um, yeah, there were half a dozen of them. They wouldn't really get much to vote, but they had the muscle. They had the thing is in a democracy. A very an armed and organized group can even though if it doesn't really have the numbers, can have the power. And during the Maidan Revolution, they were indispensable for to the success of that coup. That brought the you know brought the Western supported government to power. They provided the muscle. They apparently were responsible for this false flag event that where a number of police officers were shot. There were dozens of witnesses who said all the fire was directed from actually a building that was occupied by these far right forces. So Yanukovych, who was the president, the duly elected president at the time, fled in fear. It was because of the violence that these people could bring to bear. And unlike in the U.S., where you can say, okay, maybe there are a few people who walk around march in Nazi uniforms, right? Maybe there are 10 guys who do that in a little town in Tennessee or whatever. And it's just, and again, probably half of them were informants or whatever. But here you had entire battalions, and larger units that were in fact integrated into uh, the the
The government.
Ukrainian armed forces.
Okay.
They and armed by, with received weapons from, the Ukrainian government. So this is something that's just of a completely different order. And then they again just demonstrated their power when Zelensky was elected. Because when Zelensky was elected, he was actually elected on a peace platform. He said, we're going to make peace with Russia. We're going to implement the Minsk Accords, which Russia was supporting as a way of bringing the conflict to an end, reintegrating the Donbass into Ukraine. That was something that Putin supported, but with a certain amount of autonomy and protections. But so Zelensky, after he was elected, he went off to the front, where it was again, it was these far right groups that were actually fighting the Russians, shelling on that city, something that happens even to this day, though it's been greatly reduced because of recent Russian advances. Um, and he tried to openly state his support for the Minsk Accords, and he was basically shouted down and threatened. He was told, like, if you try to do this, you're going to be hanging from a tree, and he was told that by these far right forces. And he afterwards, he tried. There's a video out there. I haven't actually seen it, but I've heard it described a few times where he's saying, "Hey, I'm a serious person. I'm 46 or whatever he is." It's kind of silly, but he was saying like, "You can't do this to me. I'm the president," and he's gone babbling on. But they're jeering at him and threatening him, and in the end, after this experience, he realized, or he decided, that you can't beat these guys. They're serious. If I try to carry through with this, I am going to end up hanging from a tree somewhere. So yeah, they influence policy. They've shaped policy. They again, you find them at the highest levels of government. Zaluzhny, who was the chief commander of the Ukrainian armed forces until very recently, he has, I believe, two busts of Bandera in his office. Often he's filmed, and like again, these Western journalists don't know anything, but like right behind his shoulder, there's a bust of Stefan Bandera. And Zaluzhny is still he's still a force to contend with. A lot of people are saying like he's the most popular guy in the country. That if an election were held today, he would defeat Zelensky. So
Well,
this
does
is a
that
it's a real force.
well, does that mean that most people in Ukraine are have elements of Nazi ideology as part of their worldview?
Well, now this is okay. It's like a lot of people have pointed out. Again, a counter argument to the fact that okay, we have neo Nazis in Ukraine is that hey, Zelensky himself is Jewish,
Hmm.
and the guy who sponsored him, the oligarch, his name is escaping me at at the moment, but he too is Jewish. So you had a Jewish oligarch sponsoring a Jewish comedian, right? This can possibly be Nazis, right? Um, well, I think first of all, in the case of Zelensky, like he never even really considered himself Jewish. I think his father was Jewish, his mother wasn't. Technically, that would mean that he's not Jewish, but and he always downplayed that. He didn't really identify as a Jew, but now he does because it helps in dealing with the West. And when these charges about, you've got Nazis in your government come out, he said, "How can that be? I'm a Jew," right? Um, and what I think just the other day I saw something of. I think it was the Azov battalion in its current incarnation. I think it's like the Third Assault Brigade or something. It's still it's still the same people, but it had a different name. But it shows them with rainbow flags, celebrating Pride Month. And so, so various people have pointed out and say, well, how can these be Nazis? And what I would say is that, and the Russians are silly for talking about denazification because there aren't really any Nazis here. But I think there's, okay, in the West, when we think about Nazis, we tend to focus on Jews. It's all about the Jews. That's what it's been. It wasn't that originally, actually, when World War II was fought, but this is something that's developed over the decades after World War II. It's become like, World War II and the Nazis, that was all about the Jews. But on the Russian side, it was never that way, and it still isn't to that day. It was about Russia, and about Russians. And when they think about the Nazis, and what they think about this, the war that they launched against Russia that led to the death of approximately 27 million Russians.
Hmm.
We talk about the 6 million Jews or whatever, but they what they're concerned about for obvious reasons is the 27 million Russians. And, it was also part of Nazi ideology was also directed against Slavs. It saw them as inferior people, and they looked at that Eastern Europe and a good portion of Russia as a place where the Germans properly should rule. That's why I think really why Hitler launched his invasion to the east. Um, but whether or not I know there are arguments about what his motivation was, but whatever his motivation was, it resulted in the death of 27 million Russians, and that's what matters to the Russians. And so when they talk about denazification, it's about neutralizing this threat to Russia, this ideology that is intensely anti-Russian, and whatever these people are right now, they are just obsessed um, with killing Russians and hatred of Russia. I mean, that seems to be just a um, it just that seems to be the core at the core of their identity. And I
Right.
think I'm
So
afraid that that's where they've had their success. It's not that like you're getting the full spectrum of Nazi ideology being, um, shaping the minds of Ukrainians, or the Ukrainians they're all turning into Nazis or anything. But this obsession with this hatred of Russia that long predated the war, goes back to like 2000, not long after um, the fall of the Soviet Union. Uh, this this anti-Russian ideology that really began, was fostered by these far-right groups, has spread and is, a part of larger Ukrainian society, at least for that part that doesn't identify as Russian.
why though? I mean, there has to be some reason. Were they, Ukrainians, were they devastated by the Soviets and they suffered under Soviet rule? Is that why that there's this
Yeah, well,
hatred, this
that's okay.
fostered
That's part
towards?
of the explanation. Is that what the Holodomor is the starvation of Ukrainians. That millions of Ukrainians were killed in this during the collectivization of agriculture during the 1930s under Stalin. Um, and that was for real. Yeah, but there's really no and the way it's told, it began to be told in Ukrainian schools, and again with a lot of it sponsored by and by these far right groups was that this was something that was directed against Ukrainians. That it was like Russians, they've always hated Ukrainians and they wanted to kill us and they purposely did this to starve us. And I think there really isn't any evidence of that. It was the collectivization was a horrific policy, but it wasn't directed at Ukrainians per se. It was carried out, throughout the country. It's mainly because Ukraine was such an important agricultural sector, that they bore the brunt of it. But there was actually, I think, like per capita deaths were worse in other parts of the Soviet Union, like Kazakhstan and other parts of and parts of Russia proper too. And it wasn't an ethnic based. I've never seen any evidence for that, but that's the way the story is told. So it used to be, this is something, we all suffered, but it was a Soviet problem. But then it became specifically a Ukrainian one. Again, the numbers were particularly bad in Ukraine, but it was just because of this policy and because of, I think, again, the importance of agriculture in Ukraine and its importance to the Soviet Union. It was the Soviet version of Mao's Great Leap Forward. Again, it wasn't directed at any ethnic group, but there were certain parts of China that suffered particularly horribly because of it. And, millions died, and millions died in the Soviet Union too because of, similar
Do you know how many
harebrained
died
schools.
from starvation? And because I
Yeah, I
have
can't.
heard of that, and I've seen
Right.
some horrific pictures from the
Yeah,
past of
no, it was
people
horrible. It was
starving.
horrible. I mean, it was a real black mark on the Soviet Union. The 1930s were horrible times. This Stalin killed, well, more people were killed through these collectivization efforts than through anything else. But many people were killed in the Gulag, were nabbed, and sent off to the Gulag where they were worked to death.
Well, you said 27 million Russians were killed
Right.
during World War II, and then you said were there more killed through these collectivization efforts, through starvations and bad policies? I mean, what's the total death toll of from bad economic policy and Soviet command economy rule in World War II? I
Yeah.
mean,
Well, it would be quite high. There's no question about it. Um, and actually, I can't remember off the top of my head what it was for the Holodomor, but it was millions, few million.
it's
Um,
terrifying to think
yeah,
about, because this stuff wasn't that long ago. Like
right,
what something up to maybe 50 million people starved to death during the Great Leap Forward in China.
right,
Um, and then you think about what happened in World War II, where like 1 out of 3 Poles died, 1 out of 5 Russians were dead.
right.
It's just horrific numbers, and it scares me to think, could that happen again? And I guess it could. And that's why, I feel like the world leading, we're kind of slowly going towards this route. And what it can end up in is something just so awful, that I
Well, yeah, and
hope
of
we
course,
pay attention and
now
we'll
we
be
have nuclear
smart.
weapons. I mean, that 50 million could be killed on the first day if it
Yeah.
actually have a real
Well, I guess
nuclear
I'd rather it
conflict.
be guess I'd rather go in a big nuclear blast than starve to death, or to, just hiding out in the woods with roaming gangs trying to hunt you down or something.
Yeah, well, I
But
don't really want to even think of it. Yeah, I mean, it's just that's right. I mean, the horror of a world war is something that it's so horrible that we ought to be doing whatever we can to
yeah,
avoid it. And
people seem to want it. I just think people need to think
yeah, I
about, they
don't
need to
think you're right.
understand the history. Like, do you know how
Right,
horrible this will be for everybody? Your brothers, your sons, your mothers, your daughters, your friends, you might lose them, might die. I mean, think about that. 1 out of 3 people that if you're a Pole back then, everybody knows someone that's dead. I mean, even currently here, right now in Ukraine,
right.
it
Well, it's
seems
the
like
same thing in Russia.
everybody
It's
in
just right,
Ukraine knows
right,
somebody that has been
right.
injured or dead. Basically, would they say something like 80% of the country has like PTSD or something like that? I forget. But
Yeah, I think the
it's just
claim was
so,
50%, but
yeah, but yeah, but
yeah,
yeah,
no,
it's
it's
horrific.
a nightmare, right?
And it's just such a small. And then you see people just cheering it on online, and like, yeah, Russians, like, do you not have any humanity? Like,
Right.
just come at it from human. I hate Russians all you want. Just stop the killing. You know,
right.
you can get online and be angry at them on Reddit or whatever and try to be virtuous, but we're careening towards something awful. It's already, I mean, it already is awful. We're creating something that could
Right.
be catastrophic, and that we
Well, it was a
might
refusal
all
actually to
suffer.
think about this history that got us into the fix that we're in now. I mean, the Russians were giving us warnings like Ukraine is a bridge too far. This is the red line. Ukraine cannot be part of NATO. We consider this an existential threat. And you stop and think about it. Well, why would they say that? Well, again, okay, lost 27 million people during World War II, and it came through. The main forces of the German army came through Ukraine, and now you have actually people posing as Nazis. Maybe you don't think they're real Nazis, but there they are, the symbols again. They're threatening to attack, and they're getting support from the West. They're arming them.
And
Hey,
they're killing Russians,
right? Yeah, right. Exactly.
and
That's what they're
they
doing. They're talking about
and
their hatred of Russians, and they want to kill Russians.
openly,
And you
I mean,
don't care
just
about that because the president is
right. They
Jewish or
banned the
whatever.
Russian language, right?
Right, right,
They
right.
banned the
So
Russian Orthodox
yeah, so
Church.
this rings like huge alarm bells. One thing is like we take a lot of pride in our our victory in World War II, and we lionize the greatest generation, the men who went off and fought, and that's fine, that's good, but it was only 500,000 roughly who died during World War II, and we're talking about both theaters of war, the Pacific and Europe. And so roughly half of them, just died in Europe, 250,000. The Russians lost 27 million. It's just this is 54 times what we lost. 54 times. It's just something you can't really even get your head around. And
and
we
a
we
smaller
think this is
population as well, right?
right. So this is so you're so everybody in Russia does have somebody in their immediate family, and they're just go back a couple generations of their family tree, uncles, grandparents, whatever, that were lost. And so there was so many men were killed. One of the reasons that, like in the later Soviet Union, you had a lot of, female directors and doctors and so on, is that there really weren't a lot of men. So many of them were killed. Um, and that's, you stop and think, you have to stop and say, well, okay, maybe I think they're being too concerned about this, or they're being paranoid, and we have no plans to invade. But it seems like you just attempt a little bit of empathy, and you say, well, yeah, okay, they do have a reason to be nervous. Maybe we ought to address that and recognize that and work with it. But we just refuse to. We said that this is we can't talk to them. There's no compromise, and now we have this horrible war in our hands.
Right. Yeah, it's so horrific just thinking about that. I think people really do just need to they need to hear this history. I think it's very interesting to hear, and just listening to it again, it's sobering, it's just a reminder, because I don't think about it that often as well, but just it's like, my God, so many people dying, it's just, hey, yeah, it's horrible. Well, let's hope that we don't go down that path again. This is why history is so important. I feel like a lot of people brush past history and don't think about it, and, we
Hmm.
don't emphasize it, but we need to be
Right,
reminded how terrible war is so we
right.
don't do it again and
Yeah. Well, I
again.
think, because we had these recent experiences of war that were quick and far away. They're like TV wars, Iraq and whatever. I can remember that the first Persian Gulf War, and it was very popular. We achieved a speedy victory, and we watched it on TV, and there really were very few casualties on the U.S. side.
Hmm.
But you stop and go back and think of all these. But that was not a pure adversary. This was a country that couldn't really, an army that couldn't really fight back. And you'd hope that you stop and think about like what was happening to this country. We didn't. It was followed by these very cruel economic sanctions that led to the starvation of millions there. We didn't think about it. We didn't see it. It wasn't on TV. It was thousands of miles away, and it didn't concern us. But in these wars against pure adversaries, things can go horribly wrong. And you see again and again, like at the start of the war between the states and the, here in the United States, the Civil War, um, there was a lot of excitement and on both sides when it first broke out. A lot of young men, they rushed to the recruitment center or to the front lines, whatever. It was just for them it was an adventure. It would probably be over in a couple of weeks, and nobody then foresaw that it would result in the deaths of 450,000 people. It would last for 4 years. It would devastate the South. There was but this is what happens. It's what happened in the First World War too. It was just that, there was again a lot of patriotism and marching bands and waving of flags on all sides when it first broke out, and everybody had the expectation this would be quickly resolved. Maybe a couple months at the most, and then it went on for 4 years, and many tens of millions died, and really nothing was achieved. It's just you can these powers can miscalculate. They certainly can. Again, like we've talked about this, and I think we should see from the Ukraine war, what we're looking at. There was this assumption that that future wars would be speedy. They would be wars of maneuver. They would maybe a quick exchange of missiles, and hopefully, none of them nuclear, but then it would be over. Now we're seeing something again like World War One. You really do you want to have another repeat of that? This could go on for 4 years, and God knows how many people will die.
Yeah, God, it's terrifying. And now it's even scary to think about the modern warfare. It's kind of Black Mirror episodes. We'll have drones and killer robots and attack dogs and AI. It's just, oof.
Yeah, right.
It could
Well,
be
that's
a
what these
very
mercenaries have
scary.
discovered. Like, a lot of them, these guys love adventure, and they went off to places like Afghanistan or whatever. And for them, it was just, yeah, it was a thrill because, yeah, there was some risk. I'm not saying there's no risk, but the risk wasn't that great. They obviously, had the upper hand. They were fighting a weaker foe. And they said, well, back, like in Afghanistan or whatever, yeah, if you're on the front line, yes, and the bullets are flying by, and it's a little scary, but you can always go back like a couple miles and enjoy a cup of coffee and not worry about it.
Mhm.
Maybe 5 miles behind the line or whatever. He says it's not like that in this war. You go back 5 miles and you just got to constantly looking up in the sky and for drones. You got to get away the hell out of there, because it just, uh, yeah, yeah, you're vulnerable. Whenever you get out in the open, you're vulnerable for miles and miles from the front line.
Yeah, terrifying. Well, I think I've just passed draft age. I think it's up to 35, so I feel
Okay.
a little safer now. But oh God, I hope that
Well,
we
the
don't.
average age in the Ukrainian armed forces is supposed to be 43 or 44.
Oh my God.
Yeah, but
Oh, it's so scary. Well, I really hope that people come to their senses, and we don't. I have a little bit of faith because it seems like the appetite for war in America and in Western Europe is very small. People
right,
don't
right.
want it.
Yeah, again, it seems to
So
be
we're
something that
not
the
seeing
elites
marching
want.
bands, right? We're
Right,
not seeing marching bands. We don't see people running to sign up, like you're saying, during the Civil War or World War One, going
right,
to the recruitment office. So
right,
they may just
right.
not even have. They
But
may want this to do it, but they just realize that we can't
right,
get people excited for this
yeah.
war.
Well, I think
So
that's the encouraging thing, and it's just the general kind of the increasing loss of legitimacy of our leaders. Both in Western Europe and in the U.S. Makes it more difficult for them to convince their respective populations that they need to go to war.
yeah,
Just
yeah,
people are
no,
becoming increasingly skeptical. It's like, yeah, I
right.
don't believe these people
Right,
anymore.
Macron, I think, is polling at like 23% now. I mean,
Yeah,
Biden's down in the 30s. I mean,
right.
who is
Yeah,
it's
right.
just
Yeah. I mean, I saw there was a picture of the G7 leaders, and somebody put like their popularity ratings over the heads of each of them, and it was the only
yeah,
one that was halfway decent. Who I think she was still underwater, but was Giorgia Meloni from Italy. But
yeah,
she's kind of an exception. She's been kind of drifting away from the pro-war,
mm,
pro-Ukraine positions, what I've heard,
yeah.
and
That's
all the
what
others.
I've heard too. Yeah,
So yeah, that's the thing. But you do worry because governments, people can be fooled. There can be false flags. You can get, just like when the Ukraine war first broke out, there was a lot of enthusiasm for it, and something else could happen that would at least temporarily create a lot of enthusiasm. People could be fooled into signing up and going off to war. That's something to look for, to be
Yeah,
be on the
optimistic about.
outlook for.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's end it there, Dad. It was
Okay.
a very interesting history, so thank you very much. Okay, have a good rest of your Friday.
Happy Friday.